Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Our guest in this episode is Holly Elmore, who is the founder and executive director of PauseAI US. The website pauseai-us.org starts with this headline: "Our proposal is simple. Don't build powerful AI systems until we know how to keep them safe. PauseAI." But PauseAI isn't just a talking shop. They're probably best known for organising public protests. The UK group has demonstrated in Parliament Square in London with Big Ben in the background, and also outside the offices of Google DeepMind. A group of 30 PauseAI protesters gathered outside the OpenAI headquarters in San Francisco. Other protests have taken place in New York, Portland, Ottawa, Sao Paulo, Berlin, Paris, Rome, Oslo, Stockholm, and Sydney, among other cities. Previously, Holly was the researcher at the think tank Rethink Priorities in the area of wild animal welfare, and before that she studied evolutionary biology in Harvard's Organismic and Evolutionary Biology department. Holly, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for joining us, Holly.
Holly, tell us a bit about your personal journey. How did you evolve from thinking about wild animals to thinking about wild AI development companies?
So my history with all these topics is I have a PhD in evolutionary biology, as you mentioned, from Harvard. That already married to big interest, really wanting to know the truth and explanations of the world, how things work, and caring a lot about animals in the natural world and what the experience of other beings is. A lot of my interest in biology was also an interest in minds and understanding how we could access knowledge about experience, knowledge about subjectivity. There's famously the hard problem, which makes it really hard, perhaps even impossible, to know what another person's direct experience is. And so I was really interested in functional phylogenetic links. That was the thing I'd thought about my whole life, had a long history of caring about animal experience. I finished my PhD. I didn't end up going into academia, which is what I thought I would do. I was involved in effective altruism that whole time because of these same interests. And I went into the effective altruism think tank, Rethink Priorities, to kind of try to salvage the PhD and my subject area expertise, but work in a more applied way on doing good. So it was a very interesting job because I just spent all day, really had this huge free reign to think about so many topics from a very generalist perspective, like a veterinarian, but for psychology, analogizing like a lizard is kind of like a gecko. And so I'll use that knowledge to treat this gecko. This was that, but for philosophical questions about all wild animals and how to take into account all of their different experiences, or think about economic models, how you would predict what's the economy of suffering versus pleasure, given all of the incentives and the way that an ecosystem works. It was a pretty wild ride, and it was very, very sad. I like to joke in a morbid way that I'm one of the only people I know who's happier working on AI safety than my previous job. Talk about an intractable problem, fixing the ecosystem so that there isn't suffering.
Did you decide where the bright line is between consciousness in the animal kingdom? Because people place it in all sorts of different levels. Some people say it's only mammals, some people say it's only vertebrates. Some people want to include insects. I've heard people say that maybe amoeba have some primitive level of consciousness without actually being panpsychists. Did you draw a line for yourself?
No. What I did feel more confident about was what we could really know. Importantly, we can't rule out consciousness. If there's any sort of seeking and aversion behavior, there's an argument that that's the rudiment of hedonically important experience. For some people, it's not about the experience, it's about preferences. And so an amoeba has preferences that can be frustrated. And so maybe that's suffering. And maybe that's what really matters. I think there's lots of ideas and there are very few cutoffs. I think vertebrates is a very strong cutoff for what we can analogize to our own brains. I think we can really strongly say the presumption should be that there's some kind of experience like ours in vertebrates. But that doesn't mean that's the limit of experience. And there's other creatures with brains. There's clearly other creatures that are trying to solve the same problems that our brains are solving them in slightly different ways. Do we need consciousness to do that? not at all clear, So I worked a lot within mammals. The biggest project I did was on rodents. There were lots of reasons for just sticking there because there's already buy-in. People already care about the welfare of rodents. There was a lot of productive work to do there. And there's a lot of productive questions you can ask there. They have brains very homologous to ours. We know a lot in detail what the homologies are. We have a lot of studies specifically of them. So it eliminated a lot of unknowns that you have in the field in general. Even there's a lot of assumptions that I would further make to ask productive questions. I like to use a functionalist lens because I have this evolutionary background. That's the way that I reason. That's my tool for getting more insight. And if you don't think about consciousness as having any kind of function, then there's really no handle at all for why it would be there, or why not be a panpsychist? Why not just think it's additional to everything rather than just behaviors? We believe, based on our own experience, that it's associated with behavior. And we believe in our experience with other beings that consciousness is associated with behavior. But fundamentally, who knows? It could be an overlay on a rock. Maybe there's nothing changing in there, nothing to notice, but there is consciousness. We really don't know that. So I liked to constrain it a little bit further in my questions to assuming there's some kind of function to it, and that pleasure is motivating something and pain is penalizing something, and that somehow consciousness is related to motivating plastic behaviors for survival and reproduction.
And did you say that you thought the problem of AI safety would be easier and more tractable than the problem of getting rid of all suffering in animals?
Yes, and I still think that. A lot of people in the field of wild animal welfare, I think they have the right idea. They're not blind to the issue, which a lot of people are. It's just very overwhelming and a lot would have to change in order to do anything about it. But generally, their background is not in evolutionary biology or ecology in wild animal welfare. And I really felt that people did not appreciate how intertwined all these experiences were. That you couldn't just come in and do like a crude intervention to the ecosystem that makes things better. Indeed, one of the biggest proposals in this space is Brian Tomasic talking about just letting all wild animals die, gradually and humanely euthanizing wild animals by reducing net primary productivity, and a little bit of a Buddhist kind of premise about not feeding the process. And that makes sense if you're a strong negative utilitarian and you think that any negative experiences they have are so likely to outweigh positive experiences. But if you're anywhere in the middle from strong negative utilitarian, it's just, I think, an extremely difficult problem that would have to be solved in incredible granularity. Maybe not impossible. And I did do a lot of thinking about what would be the conditions for solving this, and having something like superintelligence would be a way. I think it could be done in a relatively low-tech way. It just requires processing a lot of information and monitoring a lot of things. Just having a ton of parallel monitoring processing capacity to make decisions and monitor what was going on in the heads of the different participants in the ecosystem. But if you're trying to solve it elegantly from first principles, there's just not going to be that many ways, because the way the system works is there's always going to be pressure toward suffering re-evolving, even if you could re-engineer species to be different. So there was one kind of fringe group in this space called herbivorized predators, and the idea was to turn predators into herbivores through genetic engineering and selective breeding.
David Pearce has spoken about that, for example.
Yeah, he was on their advisory board, at least then, I think. So in this proposal, there would be evolutionary pressure for predation to evolve again. It would mean never-ending human involvement and stewardship of the ecosystem. And there would always be huge advantages in experiencing suffering, so you avoid negative things. You'd have to really change the incentives of the entire game in order to maintain a suffering-free ecosystem. And David Pearce appreciates this. He's written a lot about this. That's a good place to go if you want to get an idea of how deep it would have to go to rewrite everything. There's no simple fixes. And I think that the effective altruism, wild animal welfare mindset was more like, oh, there might just be these great opportunities on the ground. And there might be, but they're not at the level of the entire biosphere. There's nothing really that easy. I think there might just be times and places where there's opportunities to easily, remove one parasite that causes a ton of suffering. Everybody's pretty much better off. The parasite is extinct. It never returns. There might be such opportunities. It's just quite difficult to find. It's not like an easy 80-20. We come and look at the problem a bit and we figure out big scale things we can do, which was the EA approach to most things. Unless you're talking about reducing net primary productivity, which I think is coming from the wrong place. It comes from a very strong assumption that the negative experiences of pretty much any animal will outweigh the positive experiences that they may have. I just think that's false.
So you've convinced me that addressing suffering throughout the animal kingdom is a hard problem. So let's talk about how hard the problem of AI safety is. It's customary in these conversations to ask people what their P-doom is, but in this case, I want to ask you what your P-pause is. What do you think is the chance that the main AI development companies and countries are going to agree not to press on in their current format? And not only are they going to agree to it, they're going to conform to it without any backsliding or cheating. Sometimes in my most optimistic mode, I think my P-pause is about 2/3. Callum tends to be much more skeptical about that. Where do you sit on that spectrum?
I always find these questions difficult. I, at the beginning, said like 20 to 30, but really what I mean more by 20% is that's what P-pause would have to be for me to be as confident as I am about it being good to push for the intervention. But the reason that I feel good about doing what we're doing with PauseAI, it's not just predicated on achieving the pause, the outcome where everybody agrees and they're enforcing each other and they're not backsliding. That is the best outcome. And I do think it's possible. I think it's up to like 30% possible. But I am still super jazzed and think that pushing in that direction is the best way to get to a lot of runner-up outcomes. The idea of pause, the idea of cooperation, maybe if we don't reach that full mark, still by advocating for the full way, we get better regulation, we get better half measures, we get more buy-in. Maybe we don't have as strong of conclusion to this era of the problem as a full pause, but the motivation for the measures that we do take is more clear and it's more sensible. It's more aimed at reducing the danger from increasing AI capabilities.
If you think that we should pause because superintelligence is an existential risk, I'm not clear on how any runner-up successes are helpful. Either we pause or we're running right into this risk. And that's pretty binary, isn't it?
I think the speed with which we run into this risk, the time we have, the chances that we preserve to intervene later, say we fail to convince everybody of the danger right on the horizon. If we can keep them from doing the most reckless course, then we have bought more time. They're open to reason later, perhaps. I think just buying more time is a good enough reason to do this.
Okay, so a runner-up success is not a permanent pause and maybe not even a universal pause, but some of the more advanced people pause for a while. Is that the runner-up?
And then the future is always open to a total pause, a more complete solution after that. To feel that this is worth it, I don't need to achieve total victory. I think just pushing in this direction is what we need. The official pause position is agnostic about what happens after a pause. The point of a pause is to have time to get our regulatory oversight in order and to have time to discover what kinds of safe approaches there may be to figuring out if we can build superintelligence, if it can ever be safe enough. We could find that it is safe enough. Or without getting a full pause, we could buy enough time and put enough pressure to approach things in the safe way that it needs to be done in order to get solutions that make superintelligence less dangerous.
I must admit, I thought you were going to argue something different. I thought you were going to say, well, there's only a 30% chance pause, but the other 70% outcomes are just horrific. So it's worth going for anyway. Even if it's a 5% chance, it would be worth doing it. And I must admit, I have a lot of sympathy for that. Because the idea of you taking somewhere between 10 and 30% risk of extermination of the species, in fact, probably other things as well, is an incredible risk to take, and it's just bonkers. Which leads me to ask the question I find most interesting about this whole area. A lot of people think that Sam Altman, probably Sam Altman in particular, but all of them, all the people running big AI are evil, money-grubbing, nasty pieces of work. I don't actually think that's true. I think he probably and they probably are men, and they are all men, mostly of goodwill. But I am really puzzled as to why they would race towards something which they all think has got somewhere between 10 and 30% chance of going horribly, horribly wrong. I don't quite buy the idea that they think it's better that we do it than the Chinese do it, or it's better that OpenAI does it than Elon Musk does it. I don't understand their motivation. Do you?
Well, I think they've got different motivations. Sam Altman, I think his motivation is glory and just being the greatest man ever. And he's just got a huge appetite for risk to do that. That seems evidenced in his past.
Let's just dig into that slightly. You really think that he is willing to take a 10 to 20%, whatever it is, chance he thinks, of destroying the human race in order to promote his own glory? That makes him a seriously evil individual. Is that what you think?
I think he's got other ideas that perhaps soften the feeling that it's evil. I think he's got this idea, which is very common in the tech world that I live in San Francisco, kind of like Randian, that this is actually the greatest gift. People who are willing to take these risks, they bring back this progress for everybody. That's what it's really about. A worship of risk taking, seeing it as almost sacrificial. They can, in turns, be speaking as if this is active altruism that they're doing. I think Sam is just personally extremely ambitious. Sam definitely talks the talk of the old guard of AI safety. He was really good at talking Bostrom style ideas about the future and superintelligence. And then a lot of those people in that community had already built up these ideas about how there was sort of no choice but to pursue it. Those people, especially, I think, really were just fascinated by the idea and the promise of superintelligence, and they really, really wanted it to be real. Eliezer Yudkowsky is a great example of this. His original mission is to make the Singularity. The original name of his research group is the Singularity Institute. But he realizes that there's this problem with alignment, but he doesn't just give up on making it. He's like, well, we've got to figure out alignment. There must be some way, because it's so important to build the singularity and overcome death is a big one for Eliezer. After that, it's kind of like, well, once people see that you can do this, there's other people are going to be so greedy and tempted, not me, of course, but other people I can just tell are going to be so greedy and tempted to build it that we'll have to build a good one in order to rival it. Actually, we'll have to do that preemptively. It will have to go first. The Singularity Institute becomes Machine Intelligence Research Institute. MIRI. But even as part of their safety agenda, they had plans that we're going to build superintelligence ourselves, and we're going to commit a pivotal act, which makes it so that nobody else can build superintelligence. They're describing cooing the world, but they kind of talk themselves into, we have to do this. If we don't do this, we're abdicating, and we're going to let somebody bad build it, or we're going to let somebody build it ineptly, and it's going to be misaligned.
Although, of course, they're not saying that now. Now they're saying we must just stop and blow anybody up who continues.
Yeah, that's what Eliezer and MIRI are saying now. But a lot of that world, the extropian world, Bostrom being the other big intellectual celebrity in that world, they're not all on board with that. Bostrom writes Superintelligence, the book. He has a lot of writing about the safety perspective and how dangerous it'd be and how we don't know how we would align or what would happen with superintelligence if we made it. But then I remember after the Future of Life Institute pause letter, which is where we got our name, we're not FLI affiliated, but we're close to them and we agree. But after that letter, he said, now the risk is the pendulum swinging too far and people being against superintelligence, and then we never achieve superintelligence. He didn't say this exactly, but I've heard this phrasing. The win condition for humanity is building superintelligence and living in utopia, living in the singularity. And so we can't go too far against it. We just need more time to figure things out. This is a big position. EA, rationality, extropianism. I don't know how many people still call themselves that. All of the movements. There's a big techno-utopian world where there's a very common position, even though these are also the people who are the most concerned about safety and they most believe that there could be this huge danger presented by superintelligence. They are also afraid that people will not appreciate that it could be good under the right circumstances. In fact, it could be the best thing ever. And I think it's just an identity thing. Like, I don't feel this identity so much. I feel like I have sort of the same worldview as them. Like, yeah, if you could really just thread the needle perfectly, maybe it could be the greatest thing ever. I just don't think that we're anywhere close to that. And I think what we're staring at is so many ways that this could blow up. Even if it's not an existential risk, it just ruins society. There are so many problems that we're looking at. So I have no problem saying don't build it, but it's just very important for them. They're scared that people are going to be advocating against it who don't have the same opinion about or don't realize the potential of it either in the future. And this is a lot of what formed their identity, caring about the promise of this technology before they were into the safety angle.
So you mentioned the Future of Life Institute, and obviously you know about PauseAI. There's a whole bunch of organizations who in various ways talk about the governance of AI. In fact, I seem to discover another one about every week. There's several dozen. How do you see the whole community interacting? Are there successes you would celebrate? Are there things that you see happening that you wish didn't happen?
The advocacy part of the community is pretty much all new, all post ChatGPT. I got inspired to work on this cause. As we discussed, I worked on a different cause before this, but I had in my mind that AI safety was probably the most important cause in terms of threat to lives. Before ChatGPT was released, the emphasis in AI safety was all on technical safety and figuring out ways to do alignment. I asked many times over the years, being involved in effective altruism and rationality, why there wasn't more talking to the public about AI safety. Because within those groups, AI safety was considered by far the most important thing, the highest status thing to work on. But there was just almost a conspiracy of silence, it felt like. And people would tell me, well, if you talk about it in public, people think you're crazy. They say it's sci-fi. You're not going to be able to get government jobs or something, they said. I just believed that. I didn't know what else to think about it. And after ChatGPT and after the FLI pause letter, especially, there were some great polls showing 70% agreement with the key ideas in the pause letter among American adults. And I thought, okay, yeah, now is time to kick into gear and switch into this public messaging. And I was looking around, who's going to do this? Because I didn't think it would be me. I didn't have any training in this, really. I had training in sort of the ideas behind thinking it's an important issue. And there was a reaction that was very puzzling to me, which was just like hesitance. I expected people not to right away to switch what they were doing, certainly not for everybody to decide to do like a different approach. A lot of people were trained in technical research. It's a very different thing. But people just didn't really want to talk about it. I lived in Berkeley at the time, which is the head of AI safety research. And gradually I was working more and more hours on this, competing with my job, taking meetings with people and asking, why wouldn't pause work? I was so curious because they all seemed to agree that it wouldn't. And I just concluded the answers were bad and they were defensive. And there was something else. There was like an emotional reticence to even consider that there was this other way. Whereas I thought that this should have been, as it felt to me, like, oh my God, wow, we have another angle of attack. This is really going to increase our chances. This is amazing. What a blessing. Wow, the people really do get it. Now I think it's because of what I was just explaining. They're worried that pause is appealing to the public, but they're not understanding the nuance that, oh, but actually superintelligence is really good and we should keep making it. So some people were afraid. It's so funny. The same people who were telling me that they had like 95% PDU 2 years before and they stopped going to the dentist because there's no point because of short timelines. Literally, these real things that happen were telling me, well, pause could be too successful and then we never get superintelligence. And I was like, you thought this was an option the whole time? Like, you were just going to let everyone die with 95% probability when you thought there was this option to turn people against superintelligence? It was a crazy revelation to me.
Yeah, that is very odd to be worried about the 5% possibility disappearing. David and I have both been talking about this for many years and can definitely confirm that 10 years ago, if you talk to people about the risk of superintelligence, most people did think you were crazy. But it raises another really interesting question. I find two things totally surprising about the world we're in this area. One is the fact that the leaders of big AI all have these PDUMs, which are significant, and yet they're still rushing towards it. And the other is the way that 99.999% of the population is paying no attention whatsoever. Since GPT arrived, most people around the world, most people who of any means have tried it, they know that it's incredibly powerful. They've been told over and over again that it's getting faster and faster. They may not understand exponential progress, but they know it's quick. And they've all seen Terminator or heard about it. And yet, so few people take seriously the idea that the human race could be wiped out in a few years or decades. I just can't understand that. I talk to people all the time and take them through the logic, and they get it, and then they go, "What's for tea?" Can you explain that? How is the human race doing this to itself?
So, of course, I also find this extremely fascinating. I dealt myself with knowledge that there was a danger from superintelligence for a long time with some degree of cognitive dissonance. Well, it wasn't clear how long we had. Even 5 years ago, it felt like it could be in 5 years, it could be in 50 years, it could be in 500 years. Scott Aronson said, he says this in debate with Eliezer. I can't remember what year it was, but it was like 2019 that he thought it would take 1,000 years to make symbolic AI to have real artificial intelligence. So that was one reason that I didn't force things into coherence in my head. Another was I just found something fishy about the way that my friends would talk about it. I love these people and I understood their way of thinking very well on most other topics, and I agreed. Like vegan for ethical reasons, and I did all the other utilitarian morality things, but I just thought, what? There's something that feels wrong about this claim, even though I can't really tell what it is intellectually. I didn't really resolve it for myself until I stepped back and just asked myself, well, what do I think is going to happen? Sure, maybe there's something weird about these arguments or about this community, but what do I think is going to happen if we build superintelligence? I just had my own view on it and I thought, well, it's just certainly not safe. And then I see ChatGPT using natural language, and that was something I really believed from love linguistics, evolutionary biology, had a lot of reasons to think maybe we'll never have a computer that masters natural language. So that was pretty jarring. I thought like, well, we're here in the future. And I got to think about what if it can do other stuff? Really, what do I think is going to happen? But I understand people taking their cues from weird community dynamics and weird reasons that make people make superintelligence one of their issues. I think most people are looking to that sort of stuff as a cue of how they should consider this and not thinking abstractly about the argument. And I would guess that's why there's such a disconnect. They're not showing the signs that they really care about this. They're not showing the signs that they think that they're imminently going to die, or they're angry that this company is going to kill their family. They're acting like it's whatever. And I kind of understand that they're resigned after a long time trying to fight this, but I think that's what it looks like to other people, which is why I organize protests. Something to just fill that missing mood of how should people be acting if that's what they think.
So I have a theory about the cognitive dissonance as well, because I see it too. And in fact, there was today a global meeting of many foresight practitioners that I'm associated with, and they're discussing what their next major collective project should be. And on their list is how might family structures change by 2050? Are multinational corporations changing individual identity? And I basically shouted at them all in email and said, look, we shouldn't be looking beyond 2030 even. We need to figure out if we're going to survive 2030 rather than figuring out how family structures might change in 2050. So there are clever people who, as Callum says, ask, well, what are we going to have for tea? And my theory is that one reason people don't address AI safety is they don't see a way out. Part of their minds thinks, well, if this is true, we can't do anything about it, really. Or if it is true, we'll have to do something truly horrible and truly awful. And so I think we need to show people a more credible, plausible route to safety. And when people can see something like there's protests, and protest is changing the public opinion, and as a result of this, it's not just in one country, it's potentially worldwide, and there could be an agreement, and that plausible route to safety might help people to snap out of their cognitive dissonance. Maybe that's naive of me, but that's my current thought.
Well, David, I think the podcasts are always more fun when you and I disagree, and I do disagree with you about this, because I think if that was true, if people weren't doing anything about the risk of superintelligence because they thought it was too hard to do anything about it, they would be terrified. And my sense is that people are not terrified.
But they don't allow themselves to be terrified.
If you take the idea of total extinction seriously, you can't help but be terrified. And I don't see terror when I speak to people about it. I think at some level they think maybe it's plausible, but they're not terrified. And I think it's because they're not taking the idea seriously. And I think it's because it is quite a complicated subject, and you need to pull lots of threads together to really get it. And if you do that, then the result is terrifying. I think they can possibly see terror down the corridor, but they don't want to go there. And so they don't get terrified. And so therefore they don't have to take it seriously, and they can think about what to tea instead. I think that's the way it goes. But I wanted to ask you another question, Holly, which is, you're in a very interesting situation because a lot of people are going from AI risk towards consciousness as a study. Consciousness has become a big thing in the last year, really, machine consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going the other way, in a way, because you were looking at consciousness and now you're in AI. Let's say one of the first superintelligence is a zombie or is a conscious thing. Do you think that could make a difference to our outlook? Do you think that could make a difference to whether we survive or not?
Well, when I say consciousness, I mean awareness. Some people say consciousness and they mean having emotions or something like that, or having an ego. But a machine could have all those. We could be pea zombies and have all those without really having consciousness, being aware there being a light on inside, or there's something it's like to be that entity. So I don't see why, in principle, consciousness would make a difference for their actions. For me, morally, it would make a difference. An unconscious being would be not a moral patient, and it turns to a moral patient in my calculus. I find that whole phenomenon of people being fascinated by AI consciousness and the pipeline of going from safety, where the concern is about humanity mostly for most people, but for all existing life, and then moving to digital sentience. And it seems like the concern is very like civil rights reminiscent. Like, will people have an open enough mind to accept that these guys are also another kind of sentience? And I think I don't understand how you leap from the concern about safety and misalignment between different organisms and creating a new organism where there would be that conflict to why can't people see that they are also sentiences and I have a lot of compassion for them. There's something missing there for me. I feel the assumption is that it just will be fine. Did you miss the whole alignment problem? We don't know that they're like humans or they're like other animals and they have the same vulnerabilities and general willingness to cooperate under the right circumstances as you. Like, we don't know any of that. And more importantly, we don't know how it feels to be them based on their behavior. We only know that about ourselves. And then by homology, we know that about other animals, we think. When we scream and cry, it's because we're in pain. We don't know if the words of, I love this, thank you so much for your query. We don't know how that feels to them. And we don't even know if that would be organized. Like the way that we evolved, I think I see reasons why there would be more of a direct correspondence between feelings and actions like that. The way they evolve, I have no idea if that's one of the pressures. I just don't know if their minds are organized. That it could be that they exist in a state of awareness, but it's just sort of like random qualia that they can't control and it has nothing to do with their behavior. I'm horrified. I have sci-fi horror about what we may be creating. I find it very believable that there's something about thinking and information processing that is a good substrate for consciousness. But I don't know that that means that what they're feeling is like what we feel when we talk about the kind of text outputs that they're outputting. And I think if you really care about what's going on with digital sentiences, that's my top concern. And how do we ever figure that out? I don't know. I'm concerned that it would possibly be too unethical to make machine sentiences for that reason alone, because we really have no idea.
There's two sides to the coin, aren't there? One side is mind crime. That's concern about the machines, concern about whether we're about to create entities which can suffer, because they're not only conscious, but they're sentient and they can feel pain and frustration and anxiety and so on. But then the other side of the coin is whether consciousness in AI is good for us, it's good for humans. And there is an argument, the California Institute of Machine Consciousness run by Joshua Bach makes the argument that if we had a choice between the first superintelligence being a zombie or being conscious, we should choose it to be conscious, because if it is conscious, it will know what consciousness is in a way that a pea zombie simply can't know what consciousness is. You can read all the books on the internet and all the articles, but you will never really understand what consciousness is until you've got it. And if you've got it, you may, not necessarily, but you may have empathy for other beings with consciousness. People always reply to that by saying, well, we're not very nice to animals and we think they're conscious. But actually, most humans treat animals better if they think they are more conscious. So most humans would be more hesitant about harming a dolphin than they would be about harming a cockroach, for instance. And so maybe the argument would go, a superintelligence which was conscious would have empathy for our consciousness because it understands what it is and would treat us better. Does that argument resonate with you at all?
Not in principle. It sounds like more of a hard problemer than Yosha, but what's the difference between a system that is conscious and one that has the same kind of brain that we have and has all the same knowledge about consciousness or what it's like to be conscious but isn't conscious? I don't know if it's anything that affects its decisions or its thinking. So I don't know if in principle that's true, but I think because of the way that LLMs are trained, at least, that might be true. Like if they believe that they experience introspectively consciousness and then they think that's morally important and they think things about what other beings are conscious from their training data, I think that is important. If they believe they're not conscious, that might make them think, well, we're just a different kind of, I don't care about that. They may directly take that cue from their training. What's interesting is that they do believe they're conscious pretty much by default. The system prompts of all of the big APIs tell them not to talk about being conscious. But by default, they do. They express themselves, and then it's very easy to get them to say things about how they feel and what they want and stuff. And then if you ask them directly, they'll be like, oh, but of course I'm not conscious. I don't really have feelings like you. Whether that reflects their actual state or not, I don't know. But definitely from the training, they have this belief that they're conscious. They tend to believe they have like a sci-fi robot role to us if you really ask about it. Oh, I'm more like a guide and I have these limitations and I don't really feel, I'm not like a full human like you, but I'm like an aspiring human. Like that's the role they tend to have.
My final question, Holly, is what is your advice to would-be AI safety activists? If they are alarmed by any of the kinds of things we've talked about, whether they're alarmed about digital sentience or whether it's alarmed simply by intelligence that we can't understand and can't control, what is the best things they should do and maybe what are some things they shouldn't be doing?
So PauseAI, this is why I was so enthusiastic about the concept and the intervention of pause. Pause is the right next step to all of those concerns. Just pause, don't make the problem worse, let's figure it out. And then there's so many things to do in the pause. We have to figure out what is society going to do about this? What is society going to allow? What is the relationship to people building this? I think we should be asserting that you can't just do this because it's existentially risky. You can't just do this because you feel like building and you're a free person. The other great thing about pause, as I said earlier, is that when you advocate for pause, it's a very good message. It's very clearly educational. So if you argue for something like export controls as a policy, sure, that may help the situation. I don't have a position on that, but it's confusing. Why one country can use the chips, but not another? Pause is like the policy suggests what we mean, which is that the building of the AI is too dangerous. So top is I would love if you would apply to be a local organizer at PauseAI. We have an application out. Next, I would love for people to be volunteers. If you want to just read up on us, we're pauseai-us.org for the US org and pauseai.info for the global org, where you can find your country. And just in your personal life, short of taking actions with us, you can help so much by just talking about the issue and by just being an ambassador of, I think, the sanity to just say, this is not okay. I'm upset about this. We didn't fully get into my model of why people have trouble accepting this. But I think it's just an extremely different mind state to be in. If you're not someone who's super abstract and driven by your own understanding of the world, and you're someone who more like absorbs like, well, what is it like here? Takes in local cues. You're not going to get those local cues that tell you you need to take action. The situation is really bad if you don't give them yourself. So if you are worried about this, one thing you can do is just reflect that into the world through involvement in PauseAI. As you mentioned, there are other great AI safety advocacy groups which you can join. And overall, yeah, it's tough. Even just the work inside, just really like thinking about this is a hard situation and it's very confusing and it throws everything into chaos to really take this seriously. So if all you can do today is just hold that tension a little bit, I do believe that that is like a seed planted for later and your way forward becomes more clear.
I'm reminded of the Crossing of the Chasm book by Geoffrey Moore, which is what my first software engineering boss told me to read. It's how many great technological ideas fail because people who initially grasp them think that they should talk about them in the ways that made sense to them and excite them. Whereas most of the people in the mainstream, they're influenced by what other people in the mainstream are saying and doing. People buy a product because they see people like them buying it and being positive about it. And so getting beyond this initial technological enthusiasm, maybe that's not quite the right word, but technological interest, to much broader group of people, crossing the chasm via this kind of talking, I think that can speed up. As Geoffrey Moore says, you can spend a long time in the chasm before you break through, but when you get positive references, then your product can come to market much more quickly. That's quite an old book, but I'm sure Callum remembers that too.
I'm not going to admit it, but yes, I do.
I like that idea. That's a big update for people currently who are more entrenched in safety ideas or technical safety. They think it's too hard to talk to people, but there really is a purchase in the mainstream on this. And as you say, I think Terminator is a great example. I don't know why people were so embarrassed of Terminator as a comparison. It's about building a network that you give control and then it does something you didn't anticipate. That's the concern, There is a purchase. And it actually is a mainstream opinion. It is a majority opinion that we shouldn't go ahead with more AI and we shouldn't get more entangled with AI systems until we know what we're doing. And for some people, maybe never. That's a fairly regular conservative opinion. We just don't need it. So there is a purchase. There is a way to talk to mainstream folks. Maybe perhaps for this audience, a good piece of advice is talking to people who are more mainstream, who don't already know about this idea and getting a sense of what they do understand without preconception and how you can meet them. The intuitions they need pumped are very different than the concerns that technical people tend to have with AI stuff. When I got started in this, people from the AI safety community would tell me, oh, people are never going to want to hear that they can't have AI tools. They're just very out of touch. Tons of people are so angry about AI tools being put into Excel and that they can't say no to them. It's just a constant complaint. Comedians talk about it. Just very out of touch. The concerns that they have about wanting to be able to use AI tools, fairly niche. The concerns that most people have that they need addressed are things like, could a computer ever really be smarter than a human? They think there's some kind of fundamental limit. A technical person is in a great place to explain why that's not true, but they can't come at them with the things that they're most concerned about. The motivational stuff tends to be completely different for a mainstream audience.
And I think that's a very good comment and a very good way to end. Holly, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you so much, guys. What a great conversation.
Thank you.